The first witness takes the stand in Donald Trump's historic criminal trial. The former president accused of paying for the silence of a woman who claimed they had an affair on the eve of the 2016 presidential election. Tonight, we talk to a North Carolina professor who's worked with the top prosecutor and defense attorney on this case. Then, after months of gridlock, billions of dollars in military aid is finally going to Ukraine in its fight against Russia. A local professor who's been to the war zone shares why the money is so desperately needed and if it'll be enough.
This ain't Texas, ain't no hold 'em.
And Beyonce's Cowboy Carter took the country world by storm, sending fans into a frenzy and her album to the top of country charts. The success has been met with lots of controversy, though, including a hard look at how black country artists are now received. North Carolina-based country singer Reese Palmer gives her honest take on what this moment could mean for black artists.
It's time to go on the record with WRAL News.
Thanks so much for joining us here for On the Record. I'm Lena Tillett. This week, for the first time in history, a jury heard testimony in a criminal case against a former American president. Donald Trump is facing 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. He's accused of covering up hush money payments made to adult film star Stormy Daniels to hide her claim of an affair from voters just before the 2016 election. In opening statements, prosecutors outlined their case, saying Trump, quote, orchestrated a criminal scheme to corrupt the 2016 presidential election. Trump's defense attorney told the jury there's nothing wrong with trying to influence voters, saying, quote, it's called democracy, while Donald Trump is calling the trial itself election interference.
This is what took me off and takes me off the campaign trail, because I should be in Georgia now. I should be in Florida now. I should be in a lot of different places right now campaigning, and I'm sitting here.
The prosecution's first witness, David Pecker, the former publisher of the National Enquirer. Pecker describing a scheme called Catch and Kill, which meant he bought unflattering stories about Trump and made sure they were never published before the election, while he amplified stories about his opponents, some he has admitted were pure lies. Tonight, we talked to a Duke law professor with rare insight on the players involved in this historic trial. Shane Stansberry served as the assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York for 8 years. He's worked with both the Manhattan District Attorney who brought the charges, Alvin Bragg, and with Todd Blanche, Donald Trump's defense attorney. Professor Stansberry, thank you so much for joining me. I want to start with opening statements for both sides. Prosecutors seem to really lay out a very simple timeline. Prosecutor Matthew Colangelo delivering that line that Trump, quote, orchestrated a criminal scheme to corrupt the 2016 presidential election. Strong words. Was it effective?
I thought it was effective. I thought actually the lawyers on both sides did their jobs fairly well. It's a shame that we can't be in the courtroom to see it. But I think the prosecution did a decent job of sort of doing a few things. One, I was very curious as to how they were going to frame this case. If we back up and remember what this case is about, we'll recall that it's about the falsification of business records, which is a misdemeanor under New York law. And then the question is, what was the prosecution's theory as to how that gets bumped up to a felony? And we've had some hints of that it's going to be related to concealment of a federal crime or a state election law crime. They very much leaned into that and framed this very much as what they call a conspiracy, and a conspiracy that was all part of a scheme to cover up stories that might impact the 2016 election. So I was interested in that. And then they very much leaned into the sort of documentary evidence and other corroboration that the jury is going to hear, because they obviously have Michael Cohen as a star witness. And so they're going to need to back his testimony up with both some documentary evidence and some other witness testimony, which we're starting to see now.
Right. We saw Pecker. What did you make of defense attorney Todd Blanche's opening statement in response to the election fraud claim? He said, quote, it's called democracy. They put something sinister on this idea as if it were a crime. You'll learn it's not. Is that effective?
He's trying to frame the case for the jury, right? These are opening statements; they're not evidence, and so I think you're starting to see in some of the cross-examination that we can talk about of Pecker that we saw today. The defense is trying to, I think, trying to frame this to the jury as kind of business as usual, right? So this was a case where, yes, there may have been payments made to quiet people or to keep stories out of the public eye, but this is something that all politicians and celebrities have to do. And this just sort of is standard fare. And so I think that is just a framing device. And so we'll see how effective it is.
Let's talk about some of the testimony we've heard so far. So David Pecker, I said, former publisher of the National Enquirer, he was talking about this practice called catch and kill. He also talked about checkbook journalism. So we want to make it clear, this is not standard journalism. This is not, these are not practices that we follow, certainly. But he said that he bought unflattering stories about Trump and made sure they weren't published before the 2016 election, very specifically before the election, and that he was amplifying negative stories about Trump's opponents. Is that compelling testimony?
Yeah, so if I was the prosecutor, I would be happy with the way this testimony went. Of course, we still have cross-examination, which just started. So you're always very confident until you see sort of someone beating up your witness. So we'll see how things go. But I think he did, the prosecutor did a fairly good job of getting what they wanted out of this witness. The testimony backed up this idea that this was a long-running conspiracy. So, right, Pecker walked through these sort of sordid operations at the National Enquirer and how they conduct their business in the way that he's described. Also, the long-running relationship between Pecker and Donald Trump, all leading up to this sort of pivotal moment in 2015, August 2015, where they describe, and Pecker described, a meeting among Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer and fixer, Trump himself, and Pecker. And so I think that's sort of the origin story that the prosecution wanted to describe to the jury, that this was a scheme that was sort of developed in the run-up to the 2016 election. And I thought they did a fairly good job of telling that story, and most critically, establishing through this testimony that this was all part of an effort to keep these stories out for the purpose of the 2016 campaign and not for some other reason.
You know, I thought it was interesting why Pecker said that he ended up not paying for Stormy Daniels' story, basically saying that he had already dished out tens of thousands of dollars blocking stories for Trump. So he told Michael Cohen directly, look, in this case, you need to pay for this story to go away yourself. Is that an important fact?
That is an important fact, and I think it is important also when it's paired with another critical part of his testimony. So this gets into the weeds a bit, but the sort of second payoff, so to speak, was to Karen McDougal. So she's the second character in this story, who was the Playboy model who was paid $150,000. And Pecker was quite clear that there was an arrangement with Trump and Michael Cohen to get reimbursed for this payment. But there was some concern at the National Enquirer and AMI, the parent company, about how to structure the contract. And so he said that the hush money payment was disguised as a contract for services so that she would get some benefits in the form of covers on the magazine and a column and things like that, all to avoid campaign finance violations. There was also some discussion about him actually meeting with lawyers at AMI, and the subtext there was that there was some concern that they might be running afoul of campaign finance violations at AMI. And as folks who are following this story know, AMI ended up having to reach a non-prosecution agreement with the Southern District of New York, with the feds, in relation to some of these payments. So I thought that was an interesting part of the story as well, because it's helpful for prosecutors when they try to describe the purpose of these payments from Donald Trump's perspective.
The defense did begin cross-examining Pecker, and they really seemed to focus on the fact that Trump was not the only celebrity that Pecker helped squash negative stories for, essentially tamping down that this was some grand scheme, but that this was kind of run-of-the-mill behavior. Is that going to be a compelling argument for the jury, you think?
We'll see. I think that, we've just started to see some of the cross-examination. Emil Bove, who I also worked with, he's a very good lawyer. He, I think, is trying to establish through this cross-examination something along the lines of what I described before, that this is all sort of standard fare. There's a standard trial technique that a lot of good lawyers use, which is you sort of drill in a phrase for the jury. His phrase was standard operating procedure. And he got some nice concessions, I thought, asking Pecker to acknowledge that the magazine, sort of practices these kinds of things with other celebrities as well. I'm sure we'll hear from the prosecution in describing how this was different, but that was the strategy, at least, I think, from the defense side.
Professor Stansberry, thank you so much for your insight, and I know we'll be talking in the future as this trial continues.
Thank you.
Coming up, tens of billions of dollars in military aid is finally going to Ukraine. Up next, we talk to a UNC professor who recently traveled to the war zone about why it's needed. Welcome back. Half a year of gridlock ended this week in Washington as Congress finally passed a foreign aid package providing funding to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. The bulk of the bill, $61 billion, will go to replenish Ukraine's depleted war chest. That country remains in the fight for its life against an invading and very powerful Russia. And after more than 2 years of war, Ukraine has been holding its own in this fight, but how much longer? I'm so happy to have my go-to expert on this issue, UNC professor of political science, Graham Robertson, joining us. He's the director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies. So, Professor Robertson, what's the state of the war, and how is Ukraine doing?
So Ukraine has been doing amazing in the sense of it's fighting a much better armed, much larger adversary, who has had been in the field now for 2 years. Ukraine was able to stop the Russian advances and then push back a little on some of the advances, taking back the only regional capital that Russia had actually captured. But then this turned into a war of attrition. And over the last year or so, Ukraine and Russia have been trading artillery barrages and fighting trench warfare. And that just suits the Russians much better. They're much better equipped. At one point recently, there's been as many as 10 Russian artillery shells for every one Ukrainian one. Often the Ukrainians now have cited firing shells that are empty, but just to make the noise and to create the sense on the Russian side that they were under attack. And obviously, that's not a situation that's sustainable.
Yeah, I saw that there was even crowdfunding campaigns by some Ukrainian soldiers just for ammo. I mean, is the military supply situation that dire?
That's right. For ammo in particular, it's really dire. A lot of the other stuff, the sort of medical equipment and bulletproof vests and netting and these kinds of things have been crowdfunded by Ukrainian civil society, by Ukrainian companies. Lots of Ukrainian firms have adopted different battalions, and so they provide a lot of the stuff that those soldiers need, including hot meals. But in terms of ammunition, that's the part that you can't make the ammunition, you can't make precision guided artillery shells in your local community. That's something you need the international community to provide for you. And so that's really where the rubber has been hitting the road. And the Russians have been making significant progress in pushing back and making gains in recent months.
The casualty toll has been really tragic. Ukraine's president saying more than 31,000 soldiers have been killed. It's unclear how many civilians have been killed at this point in this fight. What toll is all this taking on the morale of the military and of the country?
So the morale of the country was very strong at the beginning of this fight, and people believed 100% that they were going to win, and they were probably going to win by the end of last year. When the reality set in that they were not only not going to win as quickly as that, but that they were so heavily outgunned, I think this really took a huge psychological toll on Ukrainians. They trust the military enormously. The military is the most trusted institution in the country, and it has done an extraordinary job. But the sense that Ukrainians were increasingly alone in this fight, I think, has been really, really nagging. And this is one of the ways in which the passage of this legislation and the other aid that it's going to trigger from the Europeans is psychologically extremely important too for Ukrainians' morale.
Yeah, Ukraine's president visiting Washington several times, almost begging for support. It was tough to watch, but he had to convince a lot of folks, especially people in the far right of Congress, why we should be giving our money to other people's wars. What do you think his message was, and what's the most effective message?
So I think his message was essentially that if you don't fight Russia today in Ukraine, you'll have to fight them tomorrow in Finland, in Estonia, in countries that are members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which we are committed to fight to defend the territory of. And so if you let Putin get away with this power grab and this land grab here, it'll be the first of many. And most experts, I think, find that to be very credible. The echoes of 1939 and the Second World War are incredibly strong. And this was a moment where I think it took some leaders a little while to understand what history was demanding of them. And eventually the Speaker of the House of Representatives came to the conclusion that this was a moment where he had to stand up and write his name in the history books on the side of right in a situation that was pretty clear, black and white situation. And so I think that's what took a little while. But I know the Ukrainian friends of mine are just very excited and very comforted by this decision.
We'll see how this changes things. Professor Robertson, thank you so much for your time. We were showing some of the images that you took when you visited Ukraine not too long ago. Thanks so much. We have covered a lot of ground tonight, and we want to hear what you think. If you have something to say, send us an email at ontherecord@WRAL.com or find me on social media. Have a great night.